Hi, my name is Stephen Anderson. I'm a grad student in the psych department here at Penn State, and I'm going to be talking about some of my dissertation research examining how secondhand sources of empathy influence morality. So to introduce this idea, we know from prior research that empathy often influences morality. By empathy, I'm referring to how people resonate with and understand the internal experiences of others. And oftentimes when people see a victim in need and empathize with them, they're more likely to view their suffering as morally wrong, more likely to value their welfare, and more likely to feel motivated to help them. One example of this is how people think about the issue of animal welfare. So for example, by feeling empathy for a pig in the meat industry, I might now view them as a victim of a moral wrong, and as a result, come to view animal welfare as a legitimate moral issue. And what we're interested in this research is whether empathy influences morality, not only when empathizing with victims directly, but also when people feel empathy for another person's empathy, what we're calling secondhand empathy. For example, I might have a friend who feels a lot of empathy for pigs, and by empathizing with my friend's empathy, I might then come to feel concern for pigs myself and view animal welfare as a moral problem. This may be especially important when firsthand empathy fails. For example, a person might be initially unwilling to empathize with pigs, but through empathizing with their friend's empathy, they might become concerned for pigs themselves. And so our central research question here is, does secondhand empathy strengthen moral attitudes and concern for a victim? There are a number of potential impacts of this research. Theoretically, it would suggest that the link between empathy and morality is wider than typically assumed, so it can occur when people respond to other people's empathy. And practically, this insight may help us better understand how to use empathy to foster moral concern, especially when firsthand empathy fails, as I mentioned. To test this idea, we recruited 400 participants online. We had them read about a victim of interpersonal harm and a person who empathized with this victim. By interpersonal harm, I mean situations where one person hurts another person, either physically or emotionally. We randomly assigned participants to one of four groups, a firsthand empathy and firsthand control, where they were instructed to either feel empathy for the victim or describe the victim. This is kind of a common way to test the effects of empathy relative to a baseline control where people aren't instructed to empathize at all. And then to examine secondhand empathy, we included conditions where they were instructed to feel empathy for an empathizer who felt empathy for the victim, or as a control, describe the empathizer objectively. The way we set this up is we told participants that they were reading about prior research participants on a study on listening and empathy, where one person described a situation where they were a victim of a negative experience, while another person listened and responded with empathy. And this is how we set up the victim and the empathizer in this scenario. And you can see an example of this here. In terms of the study structure, we had participants read several scenarios involving an empathizer and victim. Depending on the condition they were assigned, they were either shown an image of the empathizer and instructed to feel empathy for them, or describe them, or to feel empathy for the victim, or describe the victim. We then measured their moral attitudes and concern towards the victim. We measured moral attitudes using a moralization scale, which asked some questions such as, how morally wrong do you think the scenario is? Or how morally relevant do you think the scenario is? We also measured concern by asking people how upset they felt for the victim. These were all measured on a 1 to 7 rating scale, and we averaged ratings across all scenarios. In terms of our results, these box plots show people's morality ratings across the 4 different groups. The left-hand side refers to the 2 control groups, while the right side refers to the 2 empathy groups. The red dot in this graph shows the average ratings of morality within each group. And what we found is that if you compare the empathy groups with the control groups, people reported significantly higher morality within the empathy groups. We also found no difference between the 2 empathy groups and no difference between the two control groups. And what this suggests is that secondhand empathy, so empathizing with an empathizer, increased people's morality to a similar degree as firsthand empathy. I should also note we found the exact same pattern of results for how much concern they reported for the victim. In terms of our takeaways, this suggests that secondhand empathy may be a guide for people's moral attitudes to a similar degree as firsthand empathy. In the future, secondhand empathy could be applied to future empathy interventions intended to motivate moral engagement with a variety of moral issues. I just wanted to thank my research advisor, Daryl Cameron, along with the Empathy and Moral Psychology Lab at Penn State, as well as the RDSO office at Penn State for providing support for this research.